Boosting the economy is the latest reform on Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's agenda. Hoping for more foreign dollars for India, Modi and his party, the BJP, have announced sweeping economic reforms, including the push for more foreign dollars in sectors like Indian defence and pharmaceuticals. A little later in the programme, we'll be talking to two prominent members of India's rival political parties. But first, CCTV's Shweta Bajaj joins us from New Delhi. And Shweta, what are some of the highlights of these new economic reforms?
The highlight on top, of course, is the civil aviation industry and the defence industry. These two sectors are one that have benefited hugely by the latest rung of economic reforms announced by the Indian government. The other sectors includes pharmaceuticals, also single-brand retail outlets. There are also smaller sectors like animal husbandry, where FDI has been allowed. But critical is really the civil aviation sector and defence sector. It's also given a shot in the arm to the civil aviation sector here in India. It has been suffering in the last few months. For instance, international companies like Air Asia, who entered the Indian market, weren't able to make enough money. In fact, its chief, Tony Fernandes, has been repeatedly saying that this particular FDI open gives him a larger framework to actually operate international flights out of India, helping civil aviation sector. Next in line, defence sector. It's very clear what the Narendra Modi government wants to do. It wants to make India a hub for defence manufacturing. If you look at the constraints that the industry had till now, included the original equipment manufacturers. They weren't really comfortable giving their technologies to India and setting up shop here. Now that has been taken away. The 100% FDI gives them a room to be able to actually set up shop. One of the big aims of the Narendra Modi government.
Well, of course, these are sweeping reforms. They are very significant. What's been the reaction within the Indian government and among the Indian people?
If you look at the Indian government itself, of course, as far as the ruling party is concerned, they have been hailing the economic reforms. As far as the opposition is concerned, understandably so, has been questioning the way the FDI sectors have been opened, questioning why has defence sector in particular been opened, giving access to foreign companies to set up shop here in India. The second in line, if you look at the economic platform itself, they of course are a happy lot. Across industry chambers, whether it's the Confederation of Indian Industry or CII, or the Federation of Chambers of Indian Industry called FICCI, they both have hailed the move, especially in the civil aviation sector, along with the defence sector, which is likely to see massive FDI, foreign direct investment, coming into the country. If you look at the people itself, well, as far as India is concerned, it's the youngest country. Everybody wants more jobs to be created. That remains one of the biggest hiccups. But just to give you the sense within the ruling party as well, the former finance minister who comes from the Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP, Mr. Narendra Modi's party, Yashwant Sinha has himself said that as far as India is concerned, even if the growth figures go up, the fact remains that India has many poor and they're only increasing. So really varied reactions coming in, but all in all, I think everybody wants to see some sort of results as far as economic performance and job creation is concerned.
Thanks, Shweta. That's CCTV Shweta Bajaj reporting from New Delhi. Joining me now from New Delhi via Skype is Manishankar Aiyar. He is a prominent Indian political figure and senior leader for the Indian National Congress Party. Mr. Aiyar has served as a diplomat in the Indian Foreign Service and was a member of the Indian Parliament. Mr. Aiyar, thanks for joining us. Well, with this announcement, India is now saying to the world that it is open for business. What do you make of this latest announcement by the government?
Well, rhetoric is much easier than getting it done on the ground. Having, for example, just this morning, our newspapers report that owing to certain rules relating to investment in the civil aviation sector not having been changed, despite the announcement of policy, it is going to be impossible, they say, for investment by foreigners to take place in our civil aviation sector. And at the same time, the private civil aviation sector in India is saying that we should not be extending to foreigners in India in the civil aviation sector the kind of concessions that foreign countries do not extend to us in their country. So while we welcome the announcement of liberalization of foreign direct investment in India, I think there is still a great deal of work to be done before we see these grand intentions being translated into results on the ground. We've had this repeatedly happen with us in the attempts at liberalization and globalization over the last 25 years, and I see it now happening again. So I'm only cautiously optimistic. I think the government has to do its homework, at least now, for having failed to do its homework before announcing the policy.
Now, India's growth rate is expected at around 7.6% this year. That will be among the highest in the world. Do you believe that these provisions announced by the government will help growth in India?
I totally distrust our statistics regarding GDP growth. This is not because these statistics for this year are necessarily wrong in terms of the methodology adopted, but because it shows up our growth rate as approximately 2% higher than was being achieved under the previous methodology. So one can't determine the rate of growth on the basis of methodology. There has to be a certain objectivity and comparability between different figures. But yes, the Indian economy has been on a higher trajectory for the last several years. And therefore, one might hope that notwithstanding various political and economic difficulties, we will continue to be on a higher trajectory, but without allowing these figures to dazzle us. So I take a bit skeptically the argument that India has already overtaken China. That is still to be fully established. And further, it is to be established that what we are up to just now is sustainable in economic terms, but more importantly, sustainable in political and social terms, since higher growth is translating into greater inequality. And while in a country like China, that can be contained by strong political action and one-party rule, in the kind of vibrant democracy that we have in India, I don't think we can be as neglectful of the social dimensions and political dimensions of fast growth as those with a more authoritarian system have been able to have in recent years.
The Indian Prime Minister is making much of the fact that these new measures, these new provisions or liberalization policies will make the country one of the most open in the world economically. Do you believe that's a good thing for India?
Well, we were the ones who started the opening of the economy. And so I think, to be consistent with our position in the past, we should welcome the progressive further opening of the Indian economy. But whether this is actually happening or remains in the realm of prime ministerial rhetoric, which is our prime minister's chief attribute, I'm not sure. And so instead of prejudging what might happen, I would prefer to wait and watch. Although as an Indian and a proud Indian, I would of course like to see these dreams that the prime minister is placing before the nation actually get realized.
India currently has something like 1 million job seekers coming onto the labour market every month. Do you think that these measures announced of the government will help in job creation?
Well, if we go by the past record, they won't. Civil aviation in particular is a highly technical sector. And it is only those who would otherwise have got jobs who would get better jobs in the civil aviation sector, as has happened, for example, in our information technology sector. Those who would have got jobs get better jobs. But those who wouldn't have got jobs are simply pushed out of the labor market. And that is why, compared to our requirement of close on 1 million new employment opportunities every month, we are actually getting only about 100,000 jobs every month. In other words, only 1/10 of the requirement is being met, and the backlog is growing exponentially. So the failure to ensure growth with employment and just allow jobless growth to take place is, I think, the single biggest failure of our current government and of perhaps the policies of liberalization that we have adopted for the last several years. for much of the FDI that comes into India comes with technologies that were invented for a Western economy that lacks labor. It does not, it leads to higher labor productivity by reducing the labor force. So if we have technology that is not labor intensive, then I'm afraid higher productivity may result, but not higher employment. And that means we are storing up a lot of trouble for ourselves in the future.
Mr. Aiyar, how would you rate Prime Minister Modi's economic leadership in India?
Oh, about 3 out of 10.
That's not very good. Why?
Because the single most important sector of our economy is the agricultural sector. And we have been suffering a possibly unprecedented agrarian distress over these last 2 years. And although the government appears now to be waking up to the dimensions of this agricultural crisis, the steps they are taking are not only too little, but also very hypocritical. For example, the finance minister announced a substantial increase in the budget allocation for agriculture, for the Ministry of Agriculture. And then when one looked again at the figure, we found that what was being given out of the budget of the Ministry of Finance has simply been transferred to the Ministry of Agriculture, which makes the increase in the monies available to the agriculture sector only marginally more than they have been over the last 2 years. So where is the substantive answer?
Mr. Shankar Aiyar, thanks for joining us, sir. Welcome back. We're talking about recent economic reforms in India. You've just heard from a member of the opposition party in India's government, the Indian National Congress. To respond, we're joined by Subramanian Swamy, a leader in the ruling BJP party and a current member of India's parliament. Mr. Swamy is a long-time government official and political activist. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Well, we've just heard from a member of the opposition, and he is very critical of these measures announced by the Prime Minister, saying that in many instances, these measures are okay, but they will be very difficult to implement. Not in culture, which is a very important sector in India, and that in many respects, the technology that foreign companies will be bringing to India is more suited to a Western economy, not to an Indian economy. To which you would say what?
Well, you see, the neglect of agriculture started when the Congress party under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru and thereafter Indira Gandhi had adopted the Soviet economic model, which believed in extracting resources from agriculture to finance industrial development. And agriculture never had any resources because they were bled quite substantially during the 100 years of the British imperialist rule in India. And therefore, to say that the agriculture is declining because of the 2 years of the BJP rule is a bit ridiculous. Yes, I agree that agriculture requires much more focus than ever before. But it has also, it's a sector with a great deal of potential. With a little attention, like it happened briefly under what was called the Green Revolution, we became self-sufficient. Right now, I think the most important thing that we have to do for agriculture, and that is being given shape in form of a plan now, and that is to make it a exporting sector, because we still produce the cheapest agricultural products, and even milk and flowers, we produce it much cheaper than the rest of the world. So yes, we need to focus on agriculture. There's no doubt about that.
Well, let's look at some of the other specific measures that were announced by the Prime Minister. Let's take something like pharmaceuticals. Foreign investors would now be able to own 100% of a company in India. India is one of the biggest producers of generic drugs, for instance. What stops a foreign company, say a United States company, from coming into India, buying up a company that produces generic drugs and shutting down that company?
Well, I think, you know, at the moment the policy is that you come here and start production. And if it means that shutting down the already existing Indian companies or trying to buy them, I think there would be certainly the fine print, which has still not come out, it was obviously a policy document that has come out, now the nitty-gritty will come out, and the U.S. Congress has got a large amount of testimony as to what the American companies want from India. I think the most important thing they want is intellectual property rights, and that I think Indian government will do it much better than, say, some other governments like China. So I think there should be no problem to work out in a way that the Indian domestic industry doesn't get destroyed.
What about the fact that foreign companies can now have a 100% stake in defense companies in India? Are there any national security implications for India with this measure?
Well, it's not. There cannot be much of a national security impact because most of the companies come with the government support. I mean, it's not possible for us, for example, to buy F-18 from the United States without the United States government sort of underwriting it, or the United States government getting certain guarantees from the Indian government. So even if they come here, they won't be freelancers in the sense they would be independent of their domestic government when they come here. I think this whole idea was to encourage people to make a wholesale transfer of technology and also be in a position to use India's skilled labor, which is very cheap and cheaper than China, to be able to export from India to neighboring countries which buy presently right straight out of the United States, for example.
There was a report produced by the McKinsey consultancy in 2014 which showed that 680 million Indians, that's half the population, currently live in what the report said was deprivation in India. How do these new economic measures announced by the government help those people?
Well, I won't go into the quantitative aspects of these numbers. Of course, we have a large number of poor people, there's no question about it. But it has been consistently coming down in a very quite a rapid way. And there are questions of what measures you use. But going by the United Nations Millennium Development Statistics, I would say that India would probably not have more than 30% of its population below what we call as the irreducible minimum or the starvation rate. So there have been no starvation deaths in India. There have been no famines, whereas many other countries have had famines even while there have been development. India has not at all had one single famine after the British left India. So I would say, I would not say that it's a question of looking at a glass half empty and half full. The poverty side is there, but there is also a great deal of innovation, enterprise. Young people are doing, after getting education in India, are doing extremely well in advanced countries. They are now heading big corporations in the United States, for example. So I think that's another part of the story we ought to look at. And I think poverty could be established if India were to grow at, say, 10% per year for 10 years, which is within striking distance. And that's what we are aiming at just now.
One of the other criticisms we heard from Mr. Aiyar, the Indian opposition politician, was that these policies announced by the government, getting foreign direct investment to boost growth, are classic neoliberal policies. And I mean, it's been pointed out by the IMF that these are the kinds of policies that increase inequality in a country. Is that a valid criticism?
Well, it's the inequalities increase if you do not simultaneously increase the two things. One, the agricultural sector, where a good number of the poor people live, and they will be left out in these measures, certainly. And therefore, we need a special focus, and I can tell you the Prime Minister has got that very much on his mind. And the second thing is that the small and medium industries, actually due to certain policies which, in my opinion, were misplaced, which is now being rectified, and that is the high interest, raising of the interest rates to control inflation, ended up making many of our small and medium industries sick. And some of them closed down, and then they couldn't pay back their loans, so the banks also had a lot of unpaid loans. That's because the small and medium industries actually provide bulk of the semi-skilled employment in our country. And it was very unfortunate that they had to face such a high cost of capital and had to suffer. But now that will be rectified. And along with these measures on technology, upgradation, and innovation, I think we'll have a much more balanced growth.
What are foreign investors expected to make of the fact that the very respected chief of the Indian Central Bank has announced that he will not be running for another term when his term ends in September? What are we to make of that?
Well, whether he decided or the government decided that he would only get one term, I don't know the actual position. But I was a critic because of his policies, which was one-dimensional. See, if I can just take you back a little to the American Depression of 1930. In 1926, the economists argued that if unemployment has to be removed, then the wage rates have to come down, because without the wage rates coming down, employment will not increase. But what happened is when they brought the wages down, the purchasing power also went down, and therefore the demand went down, and there was a further depression, and ultimately United States and European countries landed squarely into one of the most massive depressions that the world had seen. So economics is it's a much more general equilibrium system, and the Reserve Bank governor was plugging this line that all you have to do to control inflation is to raise interest rates. And therefore, and he was not listening to any advice from anybody. And therefore, this continued policy of his to raise interest rates has harmed our Indian economy, has put the small and medium industries completely out of business. And therefore, people like me had urged the Prime Minister not to extend his term, and which is what I think happened in the end.
The World Bank has an index in which it measures the ease of doing business in another country. India currently ranks 130 on that index. Why has it been so tough on business?
Well, it's still the legacy of the Soviet system, the colonial system. Bureaucrats love holding on to power. So it's a historical legacy. It has to be corrected. But if you look at the trend of ease of doing business, it's vastly improved. And I think more and more as years go by, we will move up quite rapidly amongst the developed countries' ease of doing business.
Mr. Subramanian, Swamy, thanks for joining us, sir.